So I'll make it short. Molly went to undergrad at USC and then law school at Georgetown. Since then, she's taught classes at Georgetown on
just
election law.
Yeah.
And she came to here from DC. She was working for a think tank called the Campaign Law Center. And they do election and campaign law pretty much all, right? Yeah. Focuses on that. So certainly she's got the experience and the education to speak to us about this. Of course, election law is just such a mess right now. And it's ridiculous. I felt ridiculous to ask Molly to speak to us for an hour on it. But I told her just to do the best she could in an hour, given the topic is so broad. Thank you. There you go.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am Molly Dems. I'm the litigation director at Network 7 Law. I've been there for about 2 years. And we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan law firm that practices primarily Montana constitutional law. And before that, I spent about 8 years doing exclusively election-related litigation, both related campaign finance, redistricting, and voting rights litigation in courts across the country and in D.C. To protect voting rights, to advocate for fair maps, and to try to hold people accountable to what is left of our campaign finance laws. And that experience was really incredible, but it was also very difficult because I graduated from law school in 2016. I decided to go to law school right around 2010, right after Citizens United was decided, because I thought, hey, we need to fix this Citizens United decision. Maybe I should go to law school and figure out how to do that. And then right before I started law school was when the Supreme Court decided the Shelby County versus Holder case, which eviscerated with the first decision, like eviscerating the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so those were two kind of formative legal decisions that both motivated me to go to law school and really informed my experience while I was there. And then I started practicing election law in 2016, right in the fall, right after taking the bar. And pretty quickly thereafter, we experienced a pretty seismic shift in the makeup of the federal courts. And that really, I think, set the stage for some of the decisions we've seen over the past 10 years. And so I really, in the 10 years that I've been practicing, witnessed what I would describe as really the federal courts putting a thumb on the scale against voting rights and against kind of fair democratic principles across the country. And I was really thrilled to leave that practice behind at the time that I did and come to Montana, where we have an incredible constitution and really solid Supreme Court that seems mostly invested in the rule of law and not in partisan advantage, is how I describe it. And so, as someone who has been practicing in this space in a nonpartisan context for my entire career, I think it's a really important thing for us to remember that these issues should be nonpartisan. They shouldn't be about party politics and party preferences. And it's been something that has really informed my practice and how I approach this work. And so I have litigated against, I believe, both parties. I have definitely run into experiences where you have parties that are involved in litigation or not involved in litigation, as the case may be, because of the impact for their particular voters. And so I see this as an area where you see a lot of party involvement, and sometimes that's for the good, and sometimes I think it's for the worse. And so one of the things I would say is that as party members and people who are committed to hopefully voting rights for everybody and fair application of the law, that's something that you keep in mind when you're getting involved in this area as well, because it's just really critical to think about the difference between doing something for partisan gain or for party gain and doing something because it is the right thing that matches your politics and matches your kind of platform or what have you. If your platform is everybody who has the right to vote should be able to access that right easily and exercise it freely, then I think that's a really strong commitment to representative democracy. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of the Voting Rights Act, because I think one of the things that is on everybody's mind kind of across the country is the Delay decision that came down at the end of this term. And it really is a pretty seismic shake-up of how voting rights litigation works under the federal constitution and under federal law. And so the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 after obviously a very long and hard-fought battle during the Civil Rights Movement and the March to Selma and the March on Washington and all of the hard work of those actors. And it was one of the most radical pieces of legislation I think this country has ever passed. And it was intentionally set with a sunset provision. I'm not going to remember the dates, so forgive me on this. But it was initially sort of primarily aimed at eliminating tests and practices and procedures that allowed mostly the southern states, but not exclusively the southern states, to organize their elections in a way that allowed them to choose who the voters would be by arbitrarily applying a grandfather clause or a literacy test or things like that. And so those were things that were very much still present at the time that the Voting Rights Act was passed. It was one of the primary targets. But in the wake of the Supreme Court decisions around the same time that dealt with equal protection clause and redistricting and the makeup of districts, relative Sims, et cetera, you have also an application of the Voting Rights Act to not just voting procedures and things like that, but also to redistricting. And so what you saw was, again, kind of a seismic shift in how elections worked because of the way that districts were drawn. So you saw initially under the Voting Rights Act a very significant shift from at-large districts to single member districts, which was a way to ensure minority representation, because if you have a at-large system, everybody votes for all the candidates. You have a small but concentrated minority population. Their votes are always going to get subsumed by the majority in that kind of at-large system. And so initially, the Voting Rights Act cases, the most significant of those that we're dealing with redistricting was the Jingles case. Sometimes people call it Jingles. The Supreme Court justices occasionally do, which just sounds wrong. So Jingles, but it doesn't start with a G. And this set a test for when a state had to draw a majority-minority district to ensure that minority populations would have an equal opportunity to vote. And so this is something that's done under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Another very important part of the Voting Rights Act was Section 5. Section 5 is the pre-clearance formula. And so when the Voting Rights Act was passed, it did two things. It created an affirmative right for people or the Attorney General. Some circuit courts don't think that people have a right to bring these cases, only the Attorney General, but that's another fun recent development in the law. To get rid of these kinds of practices and procedures or districts that are harming people, but the pre-clearance provision was anytime a state that was subject to the pre-clearance formula, the initial pre-clearance formula was part of the 1965 Act, and it got updated as time went on, but basically if you had a history of racial discrimination in your elections, you could be subject to pre-clearance under the Act. At any time you changed anything about how your elections worked, every new map that you drew, every new procedure that you adopted, it would have to be pre-cleared either by a federal district court in DC or the Attorney General of the United States. And so those were kind of the two provisions. Throughout the 70s and 80s, the Section 2 primarily was used, and Section 5 as new maps were drawn. Section 5, you would litigate the whether you had to draw a majority district, or whether the map was fair under the pre-clearance formula or under an affirmative action under Section 2. In the early 80s, there was a case that the Supreme Court heard about the Voting Rights Act that dealt with whether a plaintiff under the VRA, either in pre-clearance or Section 2, definitely Section 2, maybe also pre-clearance, had to prove intentional discrimination, or whether the Act also prohibited disparate impact, effects-based discrimination. And the Supreme Court said it has to be intentional, and Congress immediately, within the next couple of years, revised the Voting Rights Act during its periodic reauthorization. I mentioned before there was a sunset provision, and so periodically Congress will reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, sometimes tweak who is subject to pre-clearance, take some people out, add people in, etc. And when they went through that process in the early 80s, they made clear that Section 2 prohibits not just intentional discrimination, but also effects-based discrimination. And so if you have a map that has the effect of diluting minority votes, that is also subject. You can also be liable under Section 2. And so these cases continue to be brought both by the Department of Justice and by individual plaintiffs throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. In the 90s, you saw a new form of case that was being brought, and it was brought by white voters challenging majority-minority districts as racial gerrymanders. And so this is a white voter challenging a majority-minority district as a violation of equal protection because it takes race into account too much. And so that was the Shaw line of cases that was kind of built up in the 90s and created a separate test under equal protection for when you don't have enough justification to consider race in redistricting. So typically, the Supreme Court had for a long time assumed that if a district was required by the Voting Rights Act, then that was a justification for considering race, even if you were explicit about what you were doing. And so these lines of cases all kind of came to head as a second thing was happening, which was that partisan gerrymandering case before Rucho in 2018 was a case called Beef versus Jubilaire, and that was one where Anthony Kennedy essentially said, I do think that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but I don't know what the standard is for how to decide it, and so I'm not deciding this case initially as a case of partisan gerrymandering, and you have to come back with a standard that's manageable. And so all of that brings us to 2013, which is when the Supreme Court decided in Shelby County versus Holder. And in that case, they ruled that the pre-clearance formula, despite being repeatedly reauthorized and most recently in 2006 by Congress, was unconstitutional because it didn't take into account that states may no longer be discriminating. And so therefore, it was unconstitutional to penalize certain states or subject certain states to pre-clearance, but not others based on this kind of past history of discrimination. And that was basically a lifelong project of John Roberts to make that decision. He had worked with DOJ, I believe, in the late 80s and most of the 90s, and had always been very anti-Voting Rights Act during his tenure there. And so that was kind of a pretty big crowning achievement for John Roberts. What that did was, in Shelby County, the court said, it's okay that we don't have pre-clearance anymore. It's okay that people can draw unconstitutional maps, because those maps can still be challenged under Section 2. Section 2 still exists. It provides a remedy. So if you see an unconstitutional map, all you have to do is challenge under Section 2. And so the 2010 redistricting cycle saw a lot of litigation under Section 2 rather than Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And this is where you really saw an increase in states asserting partisan gerrymandering as a defense to racial gerrymandering losses. And so, especially in the South, in this country, race and politics are extremely polarized and extremely, they go hand in, there's a word for this, but I just can't remember, but they go hand in hand. There's very strong patterns of racially polarized voting where white voters in many areas tend to prefer Republicans in large numbers. Black or Latino voters tend to prefer Democrats. It's statistically evident through complicated statistical analysis called, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the term for it, but I have worked with a lot of very accomplished political scientists, statisticians in my career that do this, and we basically are able to analyze voting patterns and determine whether voting is in fact racially polarized. And it used to be that that was a key thing that you needed to be able to establish to show that a map had a disparate impact, or that it diluted the right to vote of a minority population. So that was the test set forth in the Jiggles case that I talked about that says if you have a map and you have a concentrated, geographically concentrated and large enough minority population, voting is racially polarized, and the white bloc usually votes in a way that prevents the minority population from electing their candidate of choice, then we look to the totality of circumstances. But once you've met those factors, you're likely to show a Section 2 violation. You're likely to show an effects-based claim that the map has the effect of diluting minority votes. And that was the test for many, many years under Section 2. But what you saw, and that effects-based test was very important because what you saw in the racial gerrymandering context, in the intentional discrimination context, was a defense to claims that maps were being drawn based on race, that in fact they were being drawn based on partisanship. And this is because, again, the same reason where partisanship and race are co-extensive, essentially, obviously not 100%, but then it's really easy in the mapping programs and things that you use. It used to be really easy to look at race and look at racial statistics and draw literally lines around racial populations. As mapping has gotten significantly more advanced, people use partisan shading instead to draw maps. But in many parts of the country, those partisan shading and the racial shading will be equal. And so we started having this problem in the 2010s. How do you distinguish between when someone is drawing based on race and when someone is drawing based on partisanship? And the Supreme Court developed a line of cases that essentially said you can't, in the racial gerrymandering context, intentional use of race context, you can't prove a claim unless you can disentangle race from politics. And kind of latest of those cases was Alexander versus South Carolina and the ACP. And that is one where the court said, unless you can essentially provide an alternative map that achieves the same political goals without the same racial effects, then you can't prove an intentional race discrimination claim. And then, even then, you still have Section 2. And Section 2 didn't care about intent, it didn't care about politics, it just said, look at the effect of this map. Is there a large enough minority population that could be drawn to elect a candidate of its choice, but it's not able to because the lines are drawn in such a way that you have a white minority population that is blocking that minority voting power. And that was all you had to look at. And so when the court decided Calais this spring, it essentially brought in that disentangling race from politics aspect from this racial gerrymandering line of cases into the Section 2 case. And it now says, unless you can draw a map, you can show that the effects of this map, you can achieve the same partisan goal that the legislature was trying to achieve with this map, without the racial effect, then you can't prove a claim. It's simplifying it a little bit, but essentially, Justice Alito created a test where even if you could show that the minority population was routinely being blocked, you wouldn't be able to establish that that violates the Constitution or the Voting Rights Act unless you can show that a different map can be achieved that allows those candidates to vote for their candidate of choice, but not elect a different party member, essentially. And so when you have to both show racially polarized voting and achieve a map where you give someone the ability to elect their candidate of choice, and their candidate of choice is the opposite of the party drawing the map, then it creates a near impossible test for Section 2. And so Section 2 is technically still on the books, but again, is essentially eviscerated. And so that's kind of the arc of the redistricting side of things. I think a slightly less well known, or just hasn't been quite as much on the national attention as redistricting, because I think redistricting is it's easy for people to understand in a way. It's complicated, but people really understand that where you draw the lines affects who gets elected. But we've also seen since the early 2000s a similar watering down of the ability to challenge voting procedures or policies or more different kinds of laws or regulations that affect voting in federal courts. And so there used to be two ways to do that. One was a Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act case where if you could show that a particular policy or procedure had a discriminatory effect, then you could get that struck down. And another one was under a straight kind of First and 14th Amendment right to vote claim under the federal Constitution. You don't have an express right to vote in the federal Constitution, and so the courts have kind of found one in the Equal Protection Clause and the First Amendment. And there was a series of cases that allowed people to challenge residency requirements or candidate filing deadlines or things like that that affected people's ability to vote, but were not like direct regulations for right to vote. And the other ones you often see challenges in some cases on like voter registration requirements or voter ID requirements or things like that. And that was a line of cases. It's called the Anderson-Burdick test. It basically creates a balancing test for how severe of a burden on the right to vote is this law versus how strong is the state interest in enforcing it. And it used to be a fairly kind of toothsome, I don't know if that's the right word. It was a strong test. It was something that actually had an effect. And so if you passed a residency requirement, for example, that was a year long, that might be too much of a burden on the right to vote. That doesn't have anything to do with race. It doesn't have anything to do with intentional discrimination or animus or anything like that. But having to be a resident for a year before you can exercise your right to vote is a pretty significant burden on the right to vote. And so that is something where you have to say, what's the state's interest in making you wait that long, and how to weigh that against the importance of the right to vote. And most of those were struck down. So now we have much shorter, you still have residency requirements, but they're much shorter. In the 2000s, as the idea of voter ID became really popular, then we saw a lot more challenges to those types of regulations under this Anderson-Burdick test, and we saw kind of a simultaneous watering down of the test. And what that meant was that there was a increased burden for plaintiffs challenging voting restrictions or voting regulations to show a significant impact and like a tightening up of what you could rely on. So you have to show actual impact with statistical analysis, that type of thing, along with kind of a lowering of the state's burden to actually connect its interest to the regulation. So, for example, on a voter ID law, if you require voter ID to vote in person, I'll say in a minute why I have always thought that's such a bizarre thing for people to focus on. But the voter ID is going to put on some people from voting. So you have to be able to show how many people expect to vote from voting. That gets increasingly difficult if you can't rely on statistical analysis or social science or things like that. You have to show actual numbers of people that are turning away the polls. It's difficult to do. But at the same time, the state can just say, well, we have an interest in election integrity, and voter ID serves election integrity. And so therefore, this burden is justified, and that's all we have to say. We don't actually have to show how voter ID prevents in-person voter fraud. We don't have to show how many people are actually committing in-person voter fraud. We don't have to show that this is an actual problem. We can just talk about it a lot, say that it's a very big problem, and then impose these requirements to solve the problem, the perception of the problem that we have created. And so this is one where I've always, like I said, I've always found the idea of in-person voter fraud to be a really fascinating one, because if you think about it, it's almost impossible to do. Like, if you are a person who wants to go to the polls and pretend to be someone else, you have to know that that person's registered to vote, know that they haven't voted or that they're not going to vote, and to know that none of the people in the polling place or around you in voting are going to recognize that you're not that person. It's just like a really, I've never understood anyone who would actually be motivated to do that on any scale, much less a grand scale. And so I've always thought this idea that we need polling place ID to make sure that people are who they say they are, be very, very odd when you actually think about what it would take to commit an in-person voter fraud. Anyway, so we saw this similar kind of watering down of the ability of plaintiffs to challenge these types of restrictions in federal court through the watering down of the Anderson-Burdick test, and through, on the Section 2 side of things, a case called Bradovich, who was the Attorney General of the state of Arizona. And in that case, another opinion by Justice Alito was that unless you could show that the thing you were trying to challenge, this is a complicated test, but basically you had to show that in 1986, when Congress had passed a set of factors that you consider under Section 2 to determine whether something is violating Section 2, that they would have considered the thing that you're challenging to be a restriction. So it's like a abstract kind of historical limit on when you could challenge it. So if your state, for example, didn't have absentee ballots in the early 80s, and now you're saying it's unconstitutional who we're giving, or we're challenging who we're giving access to absentee ballots to. A lot of states, for example, don't have no excuse absentee ballots like we do here in Montana, and so you might only be able to get an absentee ballot if you fit certain criteria. In Texas, one of those criteria is that if you're over the age of 65, you automatically qualify for a ballot. So there was some litigation around whether those age restrictions violated the right to vote or violated the 26th Amendment. And the courts basically said, well, absentee voting didn't exist in 1986, so it doesn't violate the Voting Rights Act because it wasn't a thing. That's essentially the right of test in a very simplified form because I haven't litigated one of those cases in a really long time. So that's kind of where we saw that side of things coming in, and then the other really significant decision that we have pre-Calais was the Rucho decision. And Rucho was the partisan gerrymandering case out of North Carolina where there had been a lawsuit challenging the North Carolina map as racially discriminatory, and the state legislature affirmatively came out and said, we didn't do this based on race, we did it because we wanted a 10-2 map, and that's what we were going for, and therefore we weren't looking at race. You can't find us in violation of the Constitution. And in Rucho, the court said that partisan gerrymandering is in fact unconstitutional, but it is not recognizable in federal courts because, or under the federal Constitution, because it's a political question that has to be left to the political branches. And it's not something that the judiciary can resolve under the federal Constitution. So that basically gave legislatures open season, whether controlled by Democrats or Republicans, to draw maps that are based on partisanship, on politics, even when, and especially when that results in racial discrimination. Because anytime you get charged with racial discrimination, you just say, oh no, we weren't doing it based on that, we were doing it based on politics, and it just so happens that as a result, we're decreasing minority voting strength as well. And so that's everything that leads up to Clay. Clay obviously makes everything so much worse, but the shining star that we have is that we still have state constitutions. And state constitutions are really important in voting rights because under the federal Constitution, states have sole power to determine qualifications for voting, and they have primary power for regulating federal elections, but also sole power for regulating state elections, right? And in our country, we don't really distinguish federal and state elections. They happen at the same time, for the most part, in federal election years at least. And so there's a 2013 decision called Arizona versus Arizona State Independent State Redistricting Committee, in which the court affirmed that state constitutions and state legislatures have authority over redistricting, and that the word legislature in the elections clause of the federal Constitution, which allows legislatures to set the time, place, and manner of federal elections, includes whatever the state constitution defines as legislature. And so if the state constitution creates an independent state redistricting committee or creates a ballot initiative or constitutional referendum process that allows the citizens to act as to legislate essentially through direct democracy, that's not a violation of the federal constitution's elections clause. And so that, plus the Richo decision where they affirmed that partisan gerrymandering might still be unconstitutional under state constitutions, meant that you have several states that have either through the legislative process, very rare, because legislators typically don't like to give up their power, or through direct democracy or constitutional amendment, or through, in Montana, we've had an independent redistricting commission in Montana since 1972. It's built in the 1972 Constitution. You have the ability to take partisanship, if not wholly, then at least mostly out of the redistricting process through that procedure. So giving that power not to the self-interested legislators, but to an independent, nonpartisan, or bipartisan commission. So that's one mechanism. And then the other mechanism is that, unlike the federal constitution, most state constitutions have some form of suffrage clause, either a free and equal elections clause or an express right to vote clause, or other protections against interference with the right to vote. And so you saw kind of in the lead up to Richo and post-Richo, a lot of state court litigation around partisan gerrymandering, with some states saying that yes, partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional under our constitution, and some states saying, no, it's totally fine, this is same as federal, we don't, state courts don't get to weigh in on this. And so now you have a different kind of patchwork across the states of like, who does redistricting and how often can you do it and what are the things that you're allowed to consider. And so that was one of the things that led into the sort of redistricting wars of the past year or so, where you saw, for example, Texas engage in the decade redistricting to draw 5 new congressional districts that it thinks will be Republican, and California essentially passing a one-time referendum to undo their nonpartisan redistricting provisions to be able to pass a map that would undo that benefit, basically. And so it's a really interesting time in redistricting, obviously, in voting rights. I haven't even touched on campaign finance, which is a whole other piece. But you have seen a significant shift in voting rights and redistricting litigation, I think, out of federal courts and more into state courts because of the more significant protections that a lot of state constitutions have for the right to vote. Here in Montana, we have several really important provisions. We have an express right to suffrage that says no power of civil or military shall interfere with the free exercise of the right to vote. I think I'm going to miss some words there, but the no power of civil or military is really the most important part. And then we also have in Montana a prohibition against political discrimination, which is one of the most unique provisions of our Constitution. I'm not aware of any other state that has the same provision in quite the same way. And so in our kind of, we have Article 2, Section 4 of the Montana Constitution. It's where our Equal Protection Clause lives, but it also prohibits discrimination on the basis of several specific characteristics, and that includes sex, it includes race, and it also includes political and religious ideas. And so Montana Constitution should expressly prohibit redistricting on the basis of should prohibit partisan gerrymandering. And so typically that hasn't been much of an issue because our state legislative and our congressional districts are drawn by a bipartisan commission. But we do have one body statewide body in the state that is drawn by the legislature and that's the Public Service Commission. And so we have a case at Upper Southern called Montana Conservation Voters versus Jacobson. that is seeking that challenged the 2021 PSC map. Well, complicated history, but challenged the most recent PSC map as a partisan gerrymander because it was drawn to guarantee that all 5 seats would elect Republicans. And we have statistical data that shows that, and it's just not representative of actual voting patterns here in Montana. And it, in fact, would mean that you couldn't elect a non-Republican to the PSC unless non-Republican vote share exceeds 50%. And so we think that's a pretty clear violation. We went to trial on that, and unfortunately we lost that trial, but we are on appeal at the Montana Supreme Court right now, arguing that case in February, and are waiting to hear from them. So we'll get to decide what it means to discriminate on the basis of political ideas and redistricting. So I have no idea what that is.
You got 15 minutes, so if you want to open it up to questions, you can do that.
I would love to take questions. Yeah.
So when is that PSC case, when will they report on? Do they usually
Could be literally any day. It's whenever they decide it. Yeah.
And the second question is, from the roadshow experience, what are your takeaways and what did you learn from that?
So I've only done a couple of roadshows myself, but it's been a really incredible opportunity for our team just to get out and talk to people in Montana. And the primary thing that we're doing there, and I know many of you saw it, so I'll probably be repeating things. So, we have the Montana Constitution requires voters to be authorized in every 20 years. That was coming out in 2030. And so the primary goal of the Constitution Roadshow is to get out and talk about the Constitution and make sure that people know what's in it and what they're voting on when they go decide whether or not to keep that document in 2030. And we're not advocating one way or the other for what people should do, but we think it's really important that people know what's in that document, know the history of that document, because it is really unique. It's one of, I am biased, obviously, because I litigated under it all the time, but I think it's one of the best constitutions in the country, and it provides a lot of really important and unique protections for people. So, yes?
When the Supreme Court decided that it couldn't decide these cases, basically, which parts of the federal constitution did it basically say we're not even going to enforce?
Yeah, it was essentially, it wasn't saying that it wasn't going to enforce certain parts of the federal constitution. What it was saying is that there's a judicial doctrine that was made up by the Supreme Court, and I don't say that like drawers on, that's just how judicial doctrines work. But they interpreted the federal constitution to limit the power of the courts to cases that are within its kind of ability to decide. And so the issue in the partisan gerrymandering cases is how do you determine how much partisan gerrymandering is too much? Because it's always been a thing, everyone's always done it, there's always been a little bit of it, so when does it cross the line? And there was a huge social science movement over the last 30 years to basically develop a series of tests and things like that that you could use to measure partisan gerrymandering. And the court basically threw up its hands and said, we don't understand any of the social science things, that's not judging, that's estimating and things like that. And so we can't find a manageable standard to decide this case. And so it's not justiciable. And it needs to be left to the political branches because how much partisan gerrymandering is too much is something for politicians to decide and not judges. It's essentially
So the equal protection clause and the other clauses are still in effect, they could be able to fall under that, basically.
Yeah, so
What you mentioned from the federal constitution.
the two that were primarily used in partisan gerrymandering litigation were the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the equal protection clause. And the court said we just don't have standards to determine when this violates those clauses. And so those clauses are still in effect. They still cover a lot of other things with varying levels of actual connectedness. But they don't govern redistricting. They don't cover partisan gerrymandering. They just can't decide partisan gerrymandering.
can ID, mandatory ID laws be seen as creating a poll tax?
I think, yes, in my opinion, yes, absolutely, because most of the time, it really depends on the law, honestly, and what alternative options there are. But if, for example, you said you have to have a U.S. passport in order to be able to vote, then I think that would be a poll tax, because a U.S. passport costs hundreds of dollars.
It also, right now, trans people can't get a passport in their lived gender.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge problem. And so again, like if that was the only option, that would be a significant burden on the right to vote for trans people. Ideally, a court would see that and strike it down. I don't know if there are federal
I'm
laws
trying to
there.
pass the SAVE Act,
Yeah,
and it's like, most of my friends can't afford a passport. I can't afford a passport,
yeah.
but they won't give me a passport in the gender that I live in.
Yeah.
Anyway, so why should I pay all that money for a passport just so I can vote?
Yeah, it's absolutely, I think it's a pretty significant, I think voter ID laws are pretty significant burden on the right to vote. In a lot of the early litigation around them, there was a lot of alternatives, right? And so it was either you can get a free voter ID card from your election office, or you can use an affidavit system that says, I don't have an ID and can't get one. And so, but I am who I say I am. And we've seen, I think I have seen those dry up a little bit, and it's begun to be harder to challenge because of the things I've explained about how the various tests and the protections under federal law have been sort of watered down over the years.
With the Montana Constitution, you said that it restricts military and civil, did you say? Civil law enforcement? So can you make it so that ICE literally falls under that?
So this is I was specifically talking about the right to suffrage provision, which says no power, civil or military, shall interfere with either the free exercise of the right to vote or the right to suffrage. I should probably remember the last part of that as well, but I do the first. And so there are restrictions on whether you consider ICE a civil or military force, whether they're subject to the Montana. There's also federal prohibitions against law enforcement at home places, and that comes out of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but it could be 65. And so there are really important provisions in place to prevent voter intimidation at the polls, arising out of kind of lived experience of the 60s when there was the Jim Crow era. And I think that's an important protection that I expect people try and use it as ammunition. Yes.
I really think that not having a passport, taking away the right to vote is horrible. Is there any organization in Montana where you can donate money so people who cannot afford to buy a passport, people can donate to that?
I don't know the answer to that, but I know, so there's some national organizations that help vote riders. It is one that helps people get necessary ID for voting. I'm not familiar with a specific one in Montana, but if I find out, I might certainly share.
I mean, there have been a lot of attempts to restrict voting from our legislature as well as like all the federal stuff going on. But I'm just curious what in your mind you think is going to be the biggest threat and biggest impact for like elections this fall? Is it going to be, people intimidating folks at polling places? I mean, some of the data that's being shared. I don't know if the SAFE Act will pass, but that sort of thing. Like, what's the biggest worry that you have?
I think if the SAVE Act passed, that would be a really significant problem for a lot of people, because it's going to prevent a lot of people on both sides of the aisle from voting, right? And so I think there is this mistaken partisan belief that if you restrict voting, you can impact outcomes, and I just don't think the data. Redistricting is a separate issue, but like literally restricting access to the right to vote I don't know that the data necessarily shares that out, and so what you're doing is creating unnecessary burdens on the right to vote out of some perceived partisan advantage, but I think it just really ignores the reality of a lot of the things. I think that, so that's number one. With SAVE, I hope it doesn't pass. I think that would be pretty terrible. I think one of the things that I'm paying most attention to is the executive orders that are attempting to regulate list maintenance and absentee voting, and not because of, mostly because of the disruption that those can cause and the uncertainty they will cause, because I think it's very clear that the president doesn't have any role in regulating elections, and executive orders don't have any force of law in that context. The U.S. Constitution is very clear that states set the time, place, and manner of elections unless Congress acts separately, which is why the SAVE Act is a different type of concern. But I think there's a real concern with confusion and uncertainty, especially around absentee voting, the attempt to restrict absentee voting to the list of voters that the U.S. Post Office approves, for example, it's just functionally impossible, I think, to achieve. Even setting aside whether it's a good idea, setting aside whether it's lawful, I think it is functionally impossible to achieve on the timeline that they would need to do that to not disrupt elections. And so there's litigation ongoing against that executive order that's been somewhat, there's a coalition of 13 states that sued, and they won relief for those states. And then there's advocacy organizations of the National Party, Democratic Party, and I don't remember if the RNC and maybe on the other side. But the National Party is kind of litigating it on a more nationwide basis. This is one area where I sometimes wonder about whether party involvement is as helpful, because it creates this it turns everything into a partisan race, right? When this is just, if you like really think about it, this absentee ballot regulation stuff that the executive order is trying to do is a nightmare for election administration, and that should be a nonpartisan issue, is that we don't want to put our election administrators through what something like that is going to put them through. So I wonder when you have the national parties then bringing up that fight against each other, whether that helps more than hurts. I think there is absolutely a role for both parties in election litigation. Oftentimes, the parties are really instrumental in election day related litigation, specifically around keeping polls open or getting them open when they haven't been, or things like that, to make sure that everybody is able to vote. They're very good at that and do quite well. But sometimes, like on these bigger issues, I worry that as someone who does this in a nonpartisan session, that you lose credibility with voters, you lose credibility with courts, or you polarize an issue that people would be more likely to agree on, and then kind of create a divide. But those are the things. I'm really concerned about people's fear of intimidation, less so than I am about actual intimidation. And I'm concerned about the confusion that having to redo elections in Alabama or Louisiana or whatever because of Calais, or having to ensure that people are getting their absentee ballot, and that process isn't being interfered with. And I think there's a really important role to play, which is to like be vigilant and pay attention and understand what is happening, but not to fearmonger, and so to be aware of possibilities and aware of bad things that can happen, but not expect them to have him or not, kind of raise the fear level to the point where, it does more harm than good. I think people voting is a really, it's a fundamental right. It's one of the most important things people can do, and there are so many barriers in place already for people to go exercise that right to vote, whether through law or just life, right? That I worry sometimes about creating an atmosphere of panic that's going to hurt people's ability to go vote or motivation to go vote more than help. But they're all valid. Everything that's been asked is also a valid concern. There's a lot floating out there. There's a lot to be concerned about. But also we've been doing elections in this country for hundreds of years, and we have an incredibly decentralized system that is staffed by everyday people, including probably some of the people in this room. And those people are really committed to helping people vote and making sure that elections run smoothly and that the procedures are followed and accounts are made and all of that. And so I think remembering that is something that I find a lot of if not hope, at least reassurance. Yes.
So I'm public waste manager here in Missoula, and what I'm worried about for this fall is the new voter ID requirements.
Yes.
For years and years, people come in with their county-issued voter ID form, and that was enough. It's no longer enough. You have to have voter ID that goes along with it. And I'm just really concerned that luckily in Missoula, 80% of people vote by mail, but there'll be a lot of people showing up at the polling place without sufficient ID. And they used to be able to just show their Wyoming driver's license for the rest of the year. That's no longer enough.
I think a Wyoming driver's license would
They have to have two, they have to have a photo ID. If it's not a Montana state issued ID or tribal or military, you have to have proof of residency also.
So in that case, if they had their voter registration card and they're
Yes.
Wyoming, that would be okay.
But most people
If most people aren't carrying all those things around at the same time, yeah. I think one really important thing to do, and it should be the job of our elected officials to do this, but is to educate the voters as much as possible. I don't know. I know Bradley here in Missoula who runs the elections is a fantastic and does a really good job. One of the things for students at least is that their students, their IDs are on their phones now, and those are acceptable for voting, so they can confirm that in court. And the other thing is just when you're out talking to your friends and you're talking about voting and they want to go vote on election day because that's what they've always done, or you're deciding at the last minute, just make sure you're telling them, hey, make sure you have your state ID with you or your passport, or if not one of those things, something with your photo on it and another piece of paper, like your voting card or whatever, because people will be turned away. They'll show up and they'll try and vote and they won't have the right to vote, or they'll be able to vote a provisional ballot and come back with their ID. And I don't like the law, obviously, over a portion of it. As I said, I think the idea of in-person voter fraud, when you really think about it, is pretty silly. Like, it's so hard to pull off. I don't know what the motivation would be. Yeah, just do as much voter education as you can so that people know what they need.
Would that be something that the city would voted for proactive candidates and not those of your candidate? Could you inform the person asking that or
you're talking to other voters, you can't tell them what the voter ID requirements are. In fact, the Secretary of State has a website that has the two voter ID requirements on it. You can just print that on and hand it to people.
Could you adjust the volume a little bit, please?
I don't know if I have that power.
I know. We have time for one more question.
Yes.
I just wanted to thank you for all that you do to representing. I tell a lot of people that you're the most important law in the state of Indiana. The work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. That's very kind. It's a great place to work. I love the work that I do. I wish that I was out of a job, but I'm not, unfortunately. And so we'll keep fighting and keep doing the work that we do. Thank you all so much.